In the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution had risen rapidly around the world. It would mark a great shift from an agrarian economy to an industrialized one. Given the rise of factories, came the rise of capitalism. Despite the goods it brought to the economy, this revolution came with its flaws. The working conditions were terrible, and although the workers had done most of the work, they would receive a small amount of money in return, while the upper class's wealth and power increased. This would lead to the rise of socialism and lead to one German philosopher by the name of Karl Heinrich Marx, born in 1818 and famous for many of his works, including Das Kapital and the Communist Manifesto, along with his colleague Friedrich Engels, who, by the way, financially aided Karl Marx. Both were heavily involved with the rising left-wing movement that was happening as a response to the exploitation of workers during the Industrial Revolution. This video will focus on Karl Marx's critique of capitalism and how it negatively affects society as a whole. Before we get into Karl Marx's critique of capitalism, we first need to define what capitalism is. Capitalism is an economic system where private individuals or businesses own capital goods. What this means is that private individuals produce with the objective of making profit. It mainly relies on the self-interest of the owner and may use a lot of labor in order to achieve said objective. So why are people such as Marx against this? Marx summarizes it down into 5 categories: class inequality, the exploitation of labor, the alienation of workers, the commodification of human relations, and the economic instability it brings. The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. That is how Marx begins his infamous pamphlet, the Communist Manifesto, emphasizing the significance of class inequality under the currently ruling capitalist economic system. He argues that capitalism itself perpetuates class inequality and class struggle. It creates a division between the capitalists, the bourgeoisie, as they were a few individuals that owned the means of production, and the proletariats, the workers, who worked for said capitalists but did not exactly own any means of production. This may also lead to monopolization, which can increase the wealth and power of a very few individuals over a vast society, which undermines even the most democratic of all institutions, and further increases class inequality. Therefore, class inequality would be inevitable thanks to capitalism. One of Marx's main critiques of capitalism is the exploitation of labor. He argued that since the means of production, so for example factories, are owned by a few individuals, the bourgeoisie, while most of the population, mainly composed of workers, are only able to provide their own work. This would lead to most of the profits generated getting unevenly distributed, i.e., the workers would only see a small amount of these profits. Sometimes these wages would shrink further to increase the owner's wealth. Marx would state, "Capital is dead labor, that vampire-like only lives by sucking living labor and lives the more labor it sucks." He shows that the capitalists will only extract the surplus value of their workers' labor in order to let their own wealth survive and prosper. Another critique of capitalism from Marx was the alienation of workers. Since the workers do not own the means of production, they become isolated from their own product and don't really have a say in their own creation, leading to the workers' lack of connection with said creation. Marx himself would state that the bourgeoisie has stripped of its halo every occupation hitherto honored and looked up to with reverent awe. It has converted the physician, the lawyer, the priest, the poet, the man of science into its paid wage laborers. He argues that workers have been commercialized to the point where they are disconnected from their own social values in their own work, reducing them to mere commodities. Speaking of commodities, a commodity is therefore a mysterious thing, simply because in it the social character of men's labor appears to them as an objective character stamped upon the product of that labor. Because the relation of the producers to the sum total of their own labor is presented to them as a social relation existing not between themselves, but between the products of their labor. According to this statement by Marx, social relationships have become so commercialized that these types of relationships are tied into economic relations, meaning that everything such as land, labor, and even human relationships are often treated as a commodity that can only be bought and sold. This holds especially true as in the past, feminist movements solely relied on the message that women can work too, which Marx would argue is not liberating women, but instead enslaving them, i.e. commodifying the feminist movement. Another point is that the employers have the ability to remove workers due to redundancy or to even generate more profit, rather than viewing them as their own people. They view them more as a replaceable asset that, if not needed anymore, should be disposed of immediately. Marx views that all of this would lead to an erosion of social bonds and even human dignity, further leading to a materialistic culture, coining the term Warenfetischismus, or commodity fetishism, the idea that economic and social relationships merely exist among materialistic goods, i.e. money, instead of a normal social relationship that exists among people, both workers and even capitalists. Marx draws a correlation with capitalism's inherent flaws and its recurring cycles of economic crises. He would mention that the commercial crises that by their periodical return put on its trial, each time more threateningly, the existence of the entire bourgeois society, concluding that eventually the bourgeoisie and the system of capitalism that they have set up will all come to an end, with one crisis that will be the cause of said collapse. This can also be seen with the aforementioned redundancy, where owners would see that since they have produced too much, they do not need these types of workers or these many workers, and thus unemployment increases, which can contribute to economic crises. Despite this, however, many capitalists would attempt to cover this as a rare occurrence and not because of the flaws of capitalism. Marx believed that capitalism was a flawed system that benefited the few and exploited the most, while also creating a dull world where important human elements such as social relationships become a commodity and are heavily tied into said economic system. He believed that soon enough, with its own crises and failures, capitalism on its own would collapse and it would eventually lead to a workers' utopia, a communist world that is free of the burdens of capitalism. Whether you agree with him or not, we should all agree that capitalism has its flaws, and that people must be able to live in comfort without fear of an impending doom such as, well, an economic crisis that could very well affect their livelihood.